Welcome to Zero Velocity. I'm your host, Brad Thorpe. Hey everyone, welcome to Zero Velocity. I'm your host, Brad Thorpe. So today, we're going to tell you a story about how you can prevent and recover from lower back pain. Traditionally, lower back pain affects 70% of the adult population. And at any given time, 25% of the American adults are currently dealing with lower back pain. It costs nations hundreds of billions of dollars annually. And I think, for the most part, low back pain is 100% preventable. How's that? A little bit shocking. Because most people think it's heredity. Most people think it's inevitable that they will end up with low back pain. I myself, I've had 2 bouts of lower back pain. One was a freak accident, and the second was a drunken freak accident. So I look at those incidents, and I personally have been able to resolve those issues and never really have to deal with low back pain again. And my goal today is to give you some insight into the architectural structure of your back, as well as just really strategies that you can use to really kind of prevent low back pain. Because the key to recovery is not getting hurt in the first place. So if you can make wiser decisions, like if you have that knowledge and confidence to make the right decision, if you have an understanding of what's really kind of going on within the structures, I think you can make a better choice. I think you can help resolve a lot of stuff. And over the last couple days, I've been reading this document, and it's put out by the US Department of Health and Human Services. And this is all on lower back pain. It gives you strategies and everything like that. So it's quite comprehensive. I will say I'm at extreme odds with this document. I think this document is one of the #1 reasons that millions of people are still suffering from back pain. You know what? I want to know where it starts. So the very, very first thing that it brings up when it comes to how do you deal with low back pain is, and I'll just pull up the slide so you guys can see what it says in this document here. So the #1 thing is drugs. That's what they recommend first. They say you have low back pain, let's start with drugs. I mean, the second thing, they kind of talk about an analgesic and NSAIDs. So basically those are your over-the-counter stuff. But the second point is opiates. America's got a drug problem. So you know what I want to know what I think of this document? It's a pile of crap because it misleads people. Because if you take a whole bunch of drugs, sure, you get rid of the pain, but you don't get rid of the problem. You put a Band-Aid on a festering open wound. So if I had a cut on this side and I put a Band-Aid on the underside, it's not going to do anything. Sure, you put a Band-Aid on it. And am I lit up? Absolutely. You want to know why? Because I've spent decades helping people with low back pain. And they lack the knowledge, they lack the confidence to fix themselves. I don't think therapeutic intervention should be a thing. I think people should have that knowledge and confidence to fix themselves. And our goal today is to discuss some of the stuff related to the low back, to give you guys the insight, to just help yourself, to stop spending a fortune on back pain. It's debilitating. People turn to opioids, and they don't go through the pharmaceutical methods or the physicians. They go through street dealers. I know people that have killed themselves because of low back pain. That's how serious of a subject it is. It's devastating, it's awful, and oftentimes it leads to drug abuse as well as suicide. All because you don't know what to do. Our goal, as I said, is to help you prevent it. Our goal is to give you some insight into how you fix it. But first, most people don't even know the structures of the low back. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to bring over my buddy here, just so we can identify where the low back is, right? So I'm just going to bring his arm out of the way. We took off his hand just for cinematic purposes, in the sense that it's usually in the way. So one of the things that I want to talk about when you're looking at your low back is you have this structure here, and these are your vertebral bodies, and this jelly-filled stuff in the center is kind of what's called your intervertebral disc. That's where you have disc herniations and stuff like that, when you have almost like a tear in the structure and you almost get like a disc bulge. Over here you have these little areas where your nerves come out of. And if they get compressed, that hurts. That impairs muscle function. But one thing I want to draw some significant attention to, and I'll just spin this guy around so you can sort of see that backside of the tissue here. So off the sides, we got what's called your transverse processes. Back here, we got your spinous process. And as I said, that big body at the front was called the body. And when you're looking at your lumbar vertebrae, traditionally, the adult human has 5 lumbar vertebrae. Some humans may have 4 or 6, they've found. So that's a different conversation, but for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to talk and reference the fact that most people have 5. So if they basically, one level underneath that bottom rib is your lumbar vertebrae, and that's your first level. Then you got your second, third, fourth, and fifth, and that fifth level joins into that sacrum, which is that sort of wedge-like shaped bone right underneath your spine. And depending on which camera we got, so if we're going to the side, we'll go over to this side camera over here. So what we have here is we have your pelvis, and it's kind of a wedge shape in there. Down here is that's your tailbone, otherwise known as your coccyx. So we're really gonna talk about your coccyx today. We'll briefly touch upon your sacrum. It's a whole bunch of fused bones. The whole architecture of your pelvis, if you think of an arc, right? One of those cathedral arcs, you got a wall, which is your leg, then you got this arch through here, and then your other side. So structurally, you have unbelievable sound structure. Bone structure, when you're connecting bone to bone, that is held together by ligaments. Hugely important. They are almost like steel. And when you're looking at the ligamentous structure, I mean, back here, it's just crazy the amount of ligaments that are in that structure and that general area. One common mistake that everyone makes when they're discussing their back, they never talk about the front of their back. I know, and that's an odd thing to say. But on the front of your back, right, because your back and your spine, so think of it as your spine, not your back. So you have the anterior surface, that's the front part. That's all down through here. And you can sort of see that intervertebral disc is still there. Right? Down that front, you have what's called your anterior longitudinal ligament. It is thick, it is strong, and it is dense. Then beyond that, you have what's called your psoas. And your psoas muscle is this muscle that traditionally people beat up on. They say, loosen it, it's too tight. Most times when you're thinking about stability, you want high levels of muscle tension, not loose tension. Loose equals laxity, right? If this is loose, it's not held together properly. Now, we'll explore that a little bit later when we're talking about looseness and dysfunction. But we also have to talk about tendons and muscles, right? So we have the bone, we have the ligaments holding bone and bone together. But if we're talking about movement, because we're human and we need to move, we have to talk about muscles. Today, we're not going to explore neurology. So recognize, neurology is hugely important into this conversation. It's just we didn't want to have a dissertation that took, 90 years to get through. And when we start talking about nerves and neurology, it gets super crazy complex, that's the word I'm looking for. See, the neurological looping mechanism there didn't work properly for me. So what we're looking at is now tendons. Well, tendons, what do? Do you guys know? I do. They connect bone to muscle or muscle to bone. Now here's the interesting thing when we start looking at the whole structure, right? As you can see, this is bone. We have approximately 206 total bones in the adult body. We have roughly 1,300 ligaments within the structure of our body holding bone to bone. So that's kind of cool. Now, if you know stuff about muscle physiology, or muscle anatomy really, you have roughly 650 muscles. And we all know that each muscle has to have a tendon on basically both ends, so at the proximal end, at the distal end. So let's call them the attachments. Now here's where it gets really exciting and really confusing, because 650 times 2 is approximately 1,300. So here's where we screw up. It's 650 muscle names. It's not 650 muscles, right? We have approximately 4,000 tendons in our body, meaning we have approximately 2,000 different muscles, not just 650 muscle names. And this is where the story is going to get kind of interesting and unique. It's going to expand your knowledge into my thought process when it comes to the resolution and the prevention of low back pain. So within this segment here, right on the front, you got this muscle called your psoas. It's really big, it's really powerful. It's actually the only muscle that connects your spine directly to your femur, or your leg is another word to say it. It basically goes from, depending on the anatomy book you read, it's either T12 or L1 down to L3, down to that what's called the greater trochanter, the lesser trochanter, which is this little nodule right here. You also have a muscle in here called your iliacus, and it comes down and it attaches and shares a common tendon with that psoas muscle. So to simplify things, people unfortunately call it your iliopsoas muscle. And the problem with simplifying things is it degrades their level of importance. Now, the interesting thing is, as I'm sitting up nice and tall here, well, I got a fixed body position. My iliopsoas is holding me up, right? Your psoas is holding you up. Your iliacus is holding you up. Combination, they flex your hip, they cause a little bit of external rotation. So it would be like this movement. But more importantly, if you're an office worker, this is huge. This stuff is huge to sitting upright and reducing shoulder pain, reducing wrist pain due to sitting improperly at your desk. But back to the story at hand. Tendons connect bone to muscle. Now, here's an interesting thing, and we'll just move this guy out of the way. So here's an interesting thing when we're looking at tendons. Most people, what they don't realize is the tendon forms the periosteum of the bone structure. Right? Remember, we just said there's over 4,000 tendons in the body. So this is where muscle function and appropriate exercise come into play at reducing the risk, i.e. prevention of low back pain, as well as the resolution of low back pain. And now when you're looking at low back pain specifically, the list of what can cause it is immense. It is like this long, Actually, I'll move my bottom hand. It's just that long. There's no bottom or there's no end to what can cause low back pain. It can be a sneeze. It can be improper sitting at a desk. It can be your lifestyle choices. I'm going to throw out one out there. It's due to low and poor isometric muscle strength. Shocking. You won't read that in the literature anywhere. The reason I mention that is because muscles generate isometric tension. And that tension is transmitted to the tendon structure. That tendon structure forms the bone. If I have poor isometric muscle strength, I have poor tension regulation within the bone structure because that tendon becomes slack. So because that lack of tension, the bone actually gets weaker. And now you get caught in this vicious cycle of weak bone. The tendon's going to self-regulate the amount of force it can tolerate in through there. Your nervous system, which is going to pop back into the conversation, your nervous system down-regulates basically the force-generating capability of the muscle because it doesn't want to traumatize the bone structure. And this is kind of an extrapolation of the research I've read. And one thing we're going to do is just going to pull up the next slide, and we're going to just look quickly at the immensity of the muscle. And can we actually pull that up nice and large so that way everyone can sort of see it? So what we want to look at is look at the complexity of all these little tiny muscles in that bottom sort of viewpoint in through there. So you're looking at muscles called your rotator brevis, your rotator longus, your rotators, like the short rotators. Then you get your intertransversial muscles, and I butcher that name all the time, so I apologize. But these are small muscles. And we can jump to the next slide, and I'll show you this one as well. This gives you, and can we get rid of the box on top there, Michael? So what we're going to show you is just the complexity of the spine structure. And what happens when you start looking at these muscles and all these tiny tendons. So if I have muscle weakness, I'm going to reduce that force generation on that tendon structure. That tendon structure leads to an impairment of bone function. And one of the things that we'll talk about is bone loss after tendon injury. And I'm going to put weakness in the category of injury. And the reason I say that is when you look at immobilization, there is a loss of tendon strength, there's a loss of bone mass, or that mineral density of the bone actually gets reabsorbed. And when we can start to look at that, that means your bone is more susceptible to things like osteoarthritis, fracturing of the lamina off the back. There's a thing called spondylolisthesis and spondylolytis, which is basically a fracturing of that lamina to various degrees. And that's just another segment of that bone structure. And if your bone, if the integrity of that structure had higher density or mineral density, the likelihood of the fracturing is drastically reduced. And this is why I'm so adamant about adding that isometric strength. And a couple of years ago, and this gets kind of interesting, I had the privilege and honor of talking with Dr. Stuart McGill. And many of you out there, if you're listening, you have at least seen his name. You might have read some of his research. You might be an advocate for or against some of the stuff he stated. He was really important in the formation of some of my thought process. I don't agree with 100% of what he recommends or recommended at the time. But one of the things that he sort of stated was, when you add motion, you add risk. Absolutely 100% in agreement with that. He went as far as to recommend not moving and increase the isometric strength and more so the isometric endurance of the muscles that stabilize the spine structure to reduce pain. That I will agree with wholeheartedly. The problem is the spine is capable of multiple directions of motion at multiple levels throughout multiple periods of time. And you need to train all of those positions. I think what we need to do is obviously add isometrics into those multiple positions. Now, what will happen when I just rapidly accelerate and I'm not prepared for that acceleration is some of these small muscles, they don't get worked as they should. When you move rapidly, the larger muscles traditionally will take over. And that's in a finely tuned athlete. To the lay person who is deconditioned, one of the things that we face is higher risk of injury because we don't have that sustained muscle endurance strength. Right? We are taught when we go to the gym to forget about the small muscles. And if you guys are, in the gym industry, you guys know what I'm talking about. They sort of say, hey, work the big muscles. The small muscles will naturally get worked. That's BS. Without an actionable plan, those muscles are overlooked, they're underworked, they're deconditioned, and that starts that cascading effect. And that's why very few young adults have low back pain. It's more so once you get into your late 20s. Let me preface that last comment with, unless you've been injured in sport, you traditionally do not have low back pain. That is a whole other conversation relative to youth back pain, injuries to spines created by sport. We're going to discuss that in a different episode later on down the road of Zero Velocity. Because that itself, as I said, that's a whole show. How do you prevent back pain in youth athletes? It's a $100 billion industry now, to be honest. But anyways, back to what we're talking about. So when we're looking at how you resolve back pain, I'm not an advocate for jumping on the drug train. And the reason for that is because it just leads to the continued dysfunction. I'm a massive fan of prevention, because if you don't get back pain, you don't have to worry about it. And simple little tools and techniques of what we're going to look at is what you can do. So we've explored the structure a little bit. We've explored the muscles a little bit. We've explored force application a little bit. And there's dynamic force application and there's isometric force application. What we're going to talk about is isometric force application. Why? Because that's what's going to help you sustain longer periods of sitting. It's going to help you generate higher levels of force for your dynamic movement. Because most people, they just start moving. The problem with that is now you've lost the ability to prepare for movement because you're now practicing movement. And when you start practicing movement, if you're prepared for it, it reduces the risk. If you're not prepared for it, it elevates the risk of back pain. So things that we can do from an assessment perspective. And this is something you can do at home. It's really, really simple. If you're an individual who does not have scoliosis, this works. What's scoliosis? It's when you get a curvature of your spine. And it's usually greater than 10 degrees. So if it's greater than 10 degrees, you would then have scoliosis. So this might not hold true for you specifically. Your condition and spinal alignment is going to be one that you need to seek highly educated professional guidance on how to resolve and reduce the risk, and potentially, if you start young enough, reduce that curvature, because it's segmental, and each muscle has, or each vertebral body and segment has a specific grouping of muscles that when you're knowledgeable and you know how to apply force isometrically to the structure, you can create a realignment of that structure. You may have to step away from the realm of dynamic movement for a while, outside of traditional everyday or daily activities such as walking and sleeping. Because one of the things is if you have asymmetries, let's say I have a greater rotation to the left, then I do have a greater rotation to the right. So that would be an asymmetry. So let's say I can rotate, and we'll just bring up to the front camera there. So if I can rotate to the left, let's say that's like, 30 degrees. And then I go to rotate to the right, but I only got like 10 or 15 degrees, like nothing much. So you would look at that and you go, there's a high probability that I'm constantly stuck in a state of left rotation. So if I were wanting to correct that position, and from a simplistic perspective, and this is kind of working within that nervous system and creating an excitation response to the muscle structure, which is going to increase the stiffness characteristics of the muscle, i.e. engagement. It's going to contract better, so we're increasing that contractility of that tissue. So all of a sudden, through an isometric, so all you have to do is find that end range and just gently pull into that end range. Doesn't have to be high intensity. I never recommend grabbing and pulling into that end range because now I'm driving facet joint into facet joint. Remember, these things on the back over here, these are the facet joints. They're the really small things. These little things in here. So if I'm driving them together, it's really bad. It would be like me putting my leg up on, well, if I put it up here. So if I put this up here and I said to the audience, jump on my knee, you guys know how bad that is. I'm going to break my kneecap. I'm going to break it. It's going to be super crazy, awful bad. Facet joint agitation, so if I'm grabbing and pulling and driving into that end range, I have to remember that my spine structure is in the way. When I start gaining increases in range, spine structure might be getting out of the way. I might be actively trying to stretch that ligamentous structure that holds bone and bone together. So that's going to create a certain level of looseness or laxity to that structure, meaning the spine is no longer held together the same. It's going to have less rigidity. It's going to have less compliance to motion because it's not held together in the proper location. It's kind of like if we said that the spine structure, let's say you're an automobile, because you guys, most people around the world understand cars and tires and bolts. So if I just loosen the bolts a little bit, so think of the think of the ligament as being like this complex bolt that basically creates pressure to hold the bones together. So if I loosen that, there's going to be this instability to the area. That instability to the area is what leads to, and this doesn't really occur unless there's a high force scenario. So it's possible, but for the traditional person that uses this term, a slipped disc, it's usually, that really doesn't exist. But you can have slight motion within structure to the point where it's still sound, but you have that weakness in structure. So you just have that little bit of laxity, or that if you're talking about your spine specifically, so you see how it's all stacked here? If you're sleeping, you have basically shear force going across that structure all the time. And what will happen is when you're looking at the shear force of the structure, that just puts you under risk. And this is where that endurance or that isometric muscle endurance comes into play again, because you guys sleep for 8 hours. It's not very dynamic unless you're tossing and turning all night long. But one thing that you have to think about is when you're looking at that structure and from a self-assessment perspective, right? So if I have a rotation, and let's say it's plus 15 on the left side relative to the total loss, because we had 10 to 15 over here and we had 30 over here. So we're plus 15 to the left is like from a rotated perspective. All I really want to do, and my goal really is to get back to as close to symmetry as I can. And I know that's a complicated process. So getting good at rotating to the right. And if I have, I have a chair here, so what I can use is that arm of the chair as an obstruction to provide resistance. And what I can do, and there's this really cool old dead dude called Oscar Konstam. And in 1917, Oscar Konstam, actually he died in 1917, in 1915, he realized that when I did an isometric for 45 seconds, I caused a reorientation or an overexcitation of the muscular system. And I was able, or he was able, to figure out that what you're able to do is reprogram the involuntary muscular system, which is absolutely wicked cool. And to the point where they created like this trick, and it's called the floating arm trick. So if I pulled my arm into an obstruction for 45 seconds at about 70 degrees, what will happen when I move? My arm just naturally floats out. And like, I'm not doing this now. That's my arm naturally doing this. And it doesn't occur in all humans, but it's a high percentage of humans that you're able to do that sort of floating arm trick. And it's, you know, it's a legit thing. There's not too much research on it. There's about 6 to 12 studies that are actually of merit that explore the Konstam phenomenon. But what it's able to do by doing a quick isometric, 45 seconds in length, that is, you're able to start to reprogram some of these muscles that you may or may not know the names of. If you want to know them, highly recommend a book by Joseph E. Musculino. It's called The Muscular System Manual. Highly recommended. It's totally awesome. My preface is the 4th edition. That's my favorite anyways. But when you start looking at stuff in muscles, when I now know that all I have to do is maybe a quick little isometric, and that's enough to reorchestrate my body position, or reorientate my body position. Well, that's cool. Once I basically can go left, okay, right, we have a level of symmetry. This is where we can start to explore stuff, because if we just start and we're asymmetrical, movement, if I'm plus 15 over here and I go to a crunch, I'm actually going to start to basically reinforce my corrupt movement patterns. And what will happen if I keep reinforcing these asymmetries, I'm going to accelerate degenerative change. And when you start to accelerate degenerative change, well, guess what? Things break down faster because you just accelerated it. So what we need to do is basically create this level of symmetry, and then we can start to explore how do we strengthen these tissues isometrically. So if we think rectus abdominis, that's this big muscle in the front, and I think all I want to do is crunch forward, and I can tighten those muscles. Now, if I had a bar coming across my upper chest, that would be amazing, because now I can have a restraint. So with you guys sitting at a desk listening to this, what you can do is slide your chair forward, and if I had like that desk, I could use my arms and just pull those arms, obviously put a towel down or something comfortable, because most desks are sharp, and then I can use that desk as a restraint. Now, that's one position. Now, we also have the lateral sides, so left and right side bending. We also have spinal extension. Now, cool thing about most chairs have a back that we can actually use. I just got to move my microphone here so I don't crush it. So if I just sit here and I pull backwards, I can start strengthening the muscles that will support my spine structure. And there's a lot of those little intricate muscles in through there. And so let's use the simplified name and called your erector spinae, right? So you got your iliocrustalis, you got your longissimus, and you got your spinalis. And these are 3 different muscles with multiple segments that have multiple tendons that need to be trained strategically. And you can accomplish that by sitting up nice and tall at your desk using that back chair. If you're looking at rotation, right, you can compare left and right rotation. So if I want to compare left rotation and side bend to the back to right rotation and side bend at the back, that's all you have to do, is actually just take the time, now that you know how to do it, right? So first, always start with left and right rotation. Then, well, there's nothing really to compare forward flexion to. If I'm looking at right side bend to that front quadrant. Now, one thing I want you to notice, I'm not shifting my whole body weight. It's not hip flexion. It's a crunch. So it's rotate, and a crunch. Rotate and a crunch. And what we're able to do when we start to understand that our goal is to have equal movement between front right, front left, side left, side right, right rotation, back corner, and there's a lot of organizations out there that do range of motion assessments, right? One of the things where I learned to do this assessment was an organization called Muscle Activation Techniques. There's some great practitioners out there in your area that can help you understand how you assess muscles when you move through range. Many of your physiotherapists and chiropractors in your local area also are well aware of how you assess range of motion deficits. Going to them with a strategy saying, hey, when I go to rotate to the left and side bend to that front right, it is not the same as when I rotate to the right and side bend front left. You can help be part of the solution. Because most people, when they just start exercising, they just start running. They just start moving. They didn't take the time to sort of say, hey, where was I today? You know, and it doesn't take much time to become aware of how your body functions. So that's one thing from a very, very quick assessment perspective. Now, when you identify some of these range deficits, what you want to do is just fix the deficit, right? So if I'm over here and that's the deficit, maybe just work on strengthening that. So if I slid forward in my chair, if I lined myself up to the corner of my desk, I could side bend and crunch. And what we want to do is we want to maintain that level of contraction for 45 seconds. Not 15 seconds, not 6 seconds. We want to take the time to get not only the muscle stronger, we want to influence that tendon structure. Because that tendon of the muscles you don't know the names of require sustained contraction in order to get stronger. Doing quick, rapid stuff, it's guess, hope, and pray. It's I guess I'm hoping it, I pray I'm hoping it, and you know, I hope I'm hoping it, training it. And those are the things that you have to sort of avoid as guess, hope, and pray. You want to be very, very strategic in your structure and how you train it. And one of the things that we have found with isometrics is when you prepare your muscle structure and it gets stronger and more resilient and it fires faster, it starts to support your spine and your lower back better. Don't forget about these muscles on the front, called your psoas, your iliacus. You also got your psoas minor. It comes down to your pubic bone. Understanding the architecture and the structure, hugely important. And what I want to do to just wrap up today is just let you know if you have questions, please reach out. Because the information, and it basically is just really an overview of how isometrics can help. But having that increased neurological firing rate to that tissue is going to help support the structure longer. And if you move faster, it's going to help slow you and speed you up safer. And it's also an effective way to basically create what's called an analgesic effect. The science will indicate that isometrics can reprogram your brain and reprogram that pain signal so you don't experience that high level of pain or dysfunction. Prevention, as I said, is one of the greatest ways to fix low back pain. Because once you get into structural damage, it becomes a lot harder. Not improbable or impossible, just harder. You may have to give up some of the things that you love to do if you consistently agitate that structure. So with your spine, you kind of only got one of them. You really wish to avoid spinal surgery that really adds Harrington rods would be my advice, because I treat people whose Harrington rods have broke. Because what happens is when you put a Harrington rod, and that's a steel rod that limits mobility, and you may need one. However, fight to the end of the earth to try to prevent ever needing one. Because those muscles will never stop trying to rotate. And those Harrington rods do bend, and they do fracture or break. And then you're stuck with a steel piece that's fused all of this stuff together. And anyone who has a spinal fusion will tell you that something else, either above or below that spinal fusion, starts to hurt later. Because your brain is going to say we need to rotate in order to move. So the key is, in my opinion, increasing the isometric endurance strength of the muscle structure before you increase the muscle strength. If you have questions, email me at brad@isophit, ISOPHIT.com. Reach out to us on social. And one of the things that I want to do, as always, I want to thank our sponsors, Zenkai Sports, as well as Kinvent and ISOPHIT for sponsoring the Zero Velocity podcast. If you go to their website, if you go to Kinvent, you can use the discount code Zero Velocity Podcast to save 10% off your purchase, as well as zenkaisports.com, and that will allow you to save 10% off your purchase of some really cool athletic apparel. Anyways, we'll see you guys next week. We'll talk soon.